lecture, we were talking about disorders of hemostasis. And so there's like two problems. One is that your blood could clot inappropriately, and the other is that your blood does not clot when it should, okay? So we were talking about problems with this, and I mentioned that we could have an embolism, and this would be, could lead to, so this is a free-floating clot, that could block small blood vessels. Yes. Okay. So we can have a cerebral embolism where the clot gets into the small blood vessels that are serving the brain. Okay, so this is different from what we mentioned, or I mentioned, as an aneurysm, which is actually a different problem. So this is called a cerebral embolism when it happens in the brain, right? And this can lead to what is called ischemic, with the I-S-C-H, ischemic stroke. And this is where the blood cannot flow to the brain, and so the brain is not getting enough oxygen and nutrients, and that means that part of the brain could die. And the characteristics of stroke, you know, they sometimes say that you need to learn the characteristics of stroke, really, because oftentimes people have small strokes before they will have the big stroke, right? And so like sudden drooping of one side of the face, sudden inability to talk because the tongue isn't working, and there's something else. Is anybody, the brain attack?
If we hurt their hands up, they'll drop on their hands.
Right, so the inability maybe to hold up both hands.
And then throw up. Like if you turn white and say you're going to throw up, that's a huge sign.
Okay. So this is ischemic stroke, and that is different from hemorrhagic stroke. And so we can look at an aneurysm. And I even spelled it wrong in your notes. There's a Y instead of a I-S, aneurysm, right? And so an aneurysm actually means a ballooning. And so this means that we have the weakening of the blood vessel walls. And so they kind of balloon out. Okay, and so you could have the blood vessels rupturing. And so if the blood vessels rupture, this can lead to what is referred to as a hemorrhagic stroke. Okay, so that's different than a ischemic stroke. So this is where you get blood on the brain, on the surface of the brain, and you can get like maybe a blood clot there. But kind of the same thing happens is that because the blood vessel ruptures, then the blood doesn't get to the nervous tissue where it's needed, and so that part of the nervous system dies, and so that part of the brain dies. Okay? And that's referred to as a hemorrhagic stroke rather than an ischemic stroke. Okay. We can also have bleeding disorders. And so we talked about one of these, and do you remember what it was? Which one did we talk about? Hemophilia. So this literally means blood loving, right? So this is where the blood does not clot properly. We can also have platelet deficiencies causing bleeding disorders. So sometimes this happens when people get radiation for cancer, because anything that kills stem cells, like in the bone marrow, anything that damages the stem cells and prevents them from reproducing would lead to a deficiency in all types of blood, but including the platelets. So anything that affects the bone marrow, any chemicals or radiation. And we can also have impaired liver function causing bleeding disorders. Okay. And so remember that those clotting factors are generally almost all produced by the liver. So this is the organ that produces the clotting factors. So if you have liver failure due to the presence of toxins, so people could be accidentally subjected to toxins that can cause their livers to shut down, or in the sense of alcoholism, alcoholism can shut down the function of the liver as well, right? And so when you have liver failure, then there's a problem with internal hemorrhaging, because the body is not able to produce the clotting factors that are necessary that allow the blood to clot. I wanted to point back up here to the, if we go back up here and talk about when clotting goes awry, there are some drugs that you can take that help to prevent the formation of clotting. And so one of these would be aspirin, right? So aspirin is known to be what is referred to as a blood thinner. So this decreases the ability of the blood to clot. And then sometimes when we take blood out of a body, we put it into a heparin or heparinized tube, and we'll actually do that on Friday. And so heparin is also a drug that prevents clotting. And then you might have heard of warfarin. That's warfarin. Right, so that would also be something that prevents blood clotting. And so people that have clotting disorders that get clots inappropriately sometimes have to be put on drugs, blood thinners, for long periods of time, right? And they have some pretty bad side effects. So it's something that you don't want to have to go on for a long period of time. Okay, are there any questions about that idea? So we're going to start talking about blood typing and transfusions. So when we talk about the type of blood, there are two different groups that we refer to. And these would include the ABO blood typing, right? And then also the RH factor. Okay, and the RH factor is what gives you the plus or the minus, right? So you could be a positive, you could be a negative, and it's a different gene that codes for a different protein on the surface of your red blood cells. Okay, so let's just talk about the ABO blood typing first. And if we look at our red blood cells, they have on the surface of their cell antigens. And so we could write the antigens as this. This would be blood type A, right? So I'm gonna maybe I'll use a different color. Okay, so this is what is referred to as an antigen. And the reason why it's called an antigen is that is actually short for antibody generating protein or molecule. So an antigen, this is an antibody generating molecule. So that means that if it is presented to a person that does not have an A antigen on their red blood cells, they'll produce in response antibodies. So the antibodies are Y-shaped molecules with binding sites. Okay, so for example, a Y-shaped molecule Oops, let's draw it a little bit different here. It actually looks more like this. Okay, so this is my Y-shaped molecule. That is my antibody. And my antibodies can come and they can bind to the antigen. So this would be what is referred to as an anti-A antibody, because it is the Y-shaped molecule that has the specific shape. It's actually a lock and key mechanism that allows it to bind onto the antigen. Okay. So let's look at the blood types. So if we have a blood type, and let's say we have type A, we're going to look at the antigen present, okay, antibodies produced, okay. So if I am blood type A, I have the A antigen, but I would produce B antibodies. Yes, so that means that if you are blood type A and you were transfused with type B blood, you would produce antibodies and it would cause the red blood cells to clump together. Okay, so B, you would produce B, you'd have B antigens, but you would produce A antibodies. Okay, if you're type AB, you have both A and B antigens. Okay, so you'd produce neither A or B antibodies. Okay, if you are type O, you have neither A or B antigens, but you would produce both A and B antibodies. Okay, so which one of these would be referred to as the universal donor? O, right? But notice how it can only receive type O blood. So if you're like a very altruistic person, right, type O would be the blood you want, but it would be, you could only receive type O blood, okay? And so this is the universal recipient. So what is this one called? AB. Universal donor, right? Wait. Oh, sorry, this is the universal recipient, sorry. Universal donor, and this is the universal recipient, sorry. Okay, so let's look at adding the plus and the negative. So if you have positive, right, the antigen that you would have the RH antigen, right? You would not produce RH antibodies. Okay, so that's what is referred to as the RH factor. You would have the RH factor. If you are RH negative, then you lack RH antigen, and you would produce RH antibodies. So if you were A positive, your blood cell would have A antigens and RH antigens associated with it. Okay. Now, where RH becomes really significant is in pregnant females. So we'll talk about RH and pregnant females in a minute. Okay. So this is a diagram that shows kind of the same thing that we were talking about. Antigens and antibodies and what you could receive, what type of blood you could receive. So if you're type B, you could receive type B and type O, right? So let's look at RH factor. This is actually called the RH factor because it was first discovered in rhesus monkeys. So rhesus monkeys have the same gene that codes for RH. Okay, so primates have similar types of blood proteins. Okay, so in pregnant females, this becomes a problem Because if a mother is Rh negative, so if a mother is Rh negative and the fetus is Rh positive, okay, she could produce antibodies that would travel across the placenta and attack the fetal red blood cells. So for some reason, the Rh factor is more significant than ABO. So ABO doesn't seem like, if I was type A and my baby's type B, that doesn't seem to have an effect, but Rh does, okay? And I'm not sure why that is the case. So they test your blood, and if they find out that you're Rh negative, they kind of assume that there's a possibility that you could produce an Rh positive baby. And so what they do is, specifically with the first pregnancy is not that big of a problem, but any subsequent pregnancy, it becomes a problem. So if we look at the first pregnancy, the mother becomes exposed during childbirth. Specifically, it becomes a problem, okay? And so in the second pregnancy, antibodies could pass across the placenta. Could cross placenta. Okay. And if they did, they could lead to what is called hemolytic anemia. So what that means is that red blood cells get, they actually agglutinate, the red blood cells will agglutinate, and that's different from coagulate. So red blood cells, so it's like a transfusion reaction where the blood cells agglutinate. Okay, so they agglutinate and then are broken down. And this could lead to miscarriage. So to help prevent this possibility, doctors will give a drug which is called RhoGAM. So RhoGAM is a drug given to pregnant females that helps to prevent the mother from getting initially exposed. So it actually, that binds to any Rh antigens and prevents maternal exposure. Okay, so the mother will end up, if you give her RhoGAM, she ends up not producing the antibodies. Okay. So has anybody in here had Rh negative? Does have Rh negative blood? No. Okay. So if you've ever become pregnant, that will be something that the doctor will be concerned about. They could actually look at what the father is, and only if he is Rh positive would you have a chance of having a child that is Rh positive. So if both the mother and the father are Rh negative, then there's not a risk. But if the father is Rh positive, then the baby could be Rh positive as well. Okay. Any questions about that idea?
Do they give it to them for every pregnancy?
I think they give it to them for every pregnancy. Okay. So if we look at the frequency of the different blood groups, it's kind of interesting to look at them in the US population because it differs depending upon what race you are, what ethnicity you are. So you'll notice that in white people, A and O are the most common. So B is relatively rare. But B is more common. You're more likely to have type B blood if you're Black or Asian. And then if you'll notice, if you're a Native American, there's very few people that are type B and almost no people that are type AB. So they're almost all type O. And so it's kind of interesting, in the past, we think that prior to interbreeding between white people and Native Americans, they did not have the gene or the allele that represented B. So they were almost entirely O with a little bit of A. Okay, so you can see that O tends to be more common. And this doesn't have the RH aspect to it. Okay, so we are moving on to a new chapter. And so this will be chapter 18. And we are going to start talking about the heart. So chapter 18 talks about the heart. And then 19 talks about the cardiovascular system. And so we are still, I just wanted to let you guys know that we're still going to have our final exam on Monday. So I decided just to keep it on Monday rather than switching it. And so Monday, the final exam is Monday of finals week. It's on your syllabus, and it's 8 to 10 in the morning, because that was our scheduled time slot. Actually, we could have it. No, we can't, because we have it 10 to 12. Yeah, we have to have it. How about 9 to 11? Okay, so let's write 9 to 11. Okay, so I think that will work because we have this room for sure during those hours. Wait a minute. See, I don't understand how this is supposed to work. Excuse me? Yeah, there's psychology at night. You know, I just talked to the secretary in the big office on campus, and she assured me that that would work. I'll have to look at it. It'll be on Monday, so we'll figure it out. It's got to be on Monday. I'm not sure how that's going to work. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the heart. So the heart is found in the thoracic cavity, which means that it is protected by the sternum and the ribs. But there's also a part of that thoracic cavity where the lungs reside. So the part where the heart actually resides is in the middle of the thoracic cavity, and that cavity has a name which is called the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is a cavity within the thoracic cavity. So this is the space where the heart sits. So our heart is covered by a protective membrane, which is called the pericardium. So peri means around and cardium means heart. So this is a membrane that is around the heart, and it has multiple layers. So the first layer of the heart that is most superficial on the outside is what is referred to as the fibrous pericardium. So this is most superficial. So it's closest to the outside. And it, like it mentions, is fibrous connective tissue. So it's made of connective tissue. So it helps to connect the heart to the other organs in the body, including the diaphragm. So we'll look at that. So it connects the heart to the other organs. And it also actually helps to prevent the heart from overfilling with blood, because it can't stretch because it's fibrous, right? So this is connective tissue. Right, that connects the heart to the other organs. Including, which is interesting, the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a muscle that actually separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, and it is really important in respiration. And this also prevents overfilling of the heart. we're going to talk about how sometimes when people get heart disease, their heart gets really large too, because it has to work so hard, and then it gets kind of flabby, so you get all kinds of problems with the heart, and sometimes it gets too big. Okay, so that's the fibrous pericardium. The next part is the serous membranes, and so we have what is called the serous pericardium, and this is double layered or double walled, double layered. And it's called serous because it's filled with fluid. So in the center, we have the pericardial cavity. Pericardial cavity filled with serous fluid. So if you think about it, it's kind of like if you had a water balloon and you stuck your hand into it and you created a space, that would be like your heart. And then the water and the double layer membrane would be like the pericardium, the serous pericardium. Okay. So the outermost layer is always referred to, and this is the same thing when we get to the lining of the lung and the digestive system. We always have what is called the visceral layer. So we call it the visceral pericardium. That is actually attached to the surface of the heart. It's the inner layer, sorry, surface of heart. So think viscera, think organs, right? So viscera, another word for organs is viscera, okay? So it is also called the epicardium, and I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so epicardium means upon the heart. So epi means upon the heart, okay? Then we have what is called the parietal pericardium. So that's the outermost. Okay, so this is the outer layer. Okay, and in between visceral and parietal pericardium is the cavity in which the heart sits. Okay. So if we look at a diagram showing the location of the heart and the major structures, you'll notice one thing, that the heart kind of sits over to one side, right? And it kind of actually also influences the size of the lungs, because one side of the lungs is smaller than the other. And so when we use our right hand and we place it over the left side of our heart, that's because our heart sits to this side of the body, okay? So if we look at this diagram, we can see that we have the lungs around the middle of the heart, and so the mediastinum is just the center of the thoracic cavity. And then if we look at this diagram here, you can see the outside fibrous layer, and how in this particular instance is connected. You can see these fibrous fibers. It's connected to the diaphragm. So the orientation of the heart, when we look at it, it's kind of confusing, because when I look at this and I see that this is the left lung, right? So this is my left lung, but when I'm looking at it, that's on the right side of my paper, right? Correct, I mean, okay. So this is actually the left side of my lung, actually my heart, and this is the right side of my heart. And so it is exactly opposite when you're actually looking at them in the book. And the reason is it's from the perspective of anatomical position. So you have to think about what side is it to the person. Okay, so you need to realize that if it's on the left side of the paper, it's actually the right side of the heart. Okay. So then looking at the layers, right? This is a diagram you should study. This is the fibrous. Then you have the parietal layer, and then you have the visceral layer, and in between you have that pericardial cavity, okay? So what this does, this serous fluid, is it allows for the heart to move in a friction-free fashion. So when the heart contracts and relaxes, it's moving within the sac, and the serous fluid helps to reduce the friction, okay? So there are a couple of syndromes or things that can happen. If you get infection in these membranes, sometimes you can get what is called pericardial friction rub. So this means that you do not have enough serous fluid. And this could be due to an infection, right? Where the membrane is not producing the enough serous fluid. And supposedly you can hear it. So if people are having chest pains and their heart hurts and you listen to it, supposedly it sounds squeaky, right? And so it's every time your heart beats, you're like, oh, this hurts, right? So it can lead to angina or heart pain, okay? So there's another opposite of this, which is called cardiac tamponade. And I think that means drum. Tamponade, sorry, tamponade. I always think of like the stuff you put on top of, when they see this word, I always think of the stuff you put on top of crackers, but I don't think that's what it means. Okay. Okay, tamponade, cardiac tamponade. So this means that you have too much. And so this means that the heart cannot beat properly, and so you can't get enough blood out, and so you feel like you don't have enough oxygen in your body, and your heart is not able to pump enough blood. So it also makes you weak, and so this means you have too much.
So how do they treat those two?
You know, I think you go into the hospital, and I'm not sure if they just treat you for whatever the infection that's causing it. Do you know how?
Tamponade, you have to have surgery because it's normally like your pericardium fills up with blood, and then your heart can't expand with refill. And then I don't know about
The frictional rub. Have you ever heard it on anybody's chest? No. Have you heard it with the pleural cavities? Pleuritis?
There's a lot of different things you can hear.
Right.
Mostly it's filled with fluid.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess it could be serous fluid, but it could also be blood. So it could be due to hemorrhaging. Okay. Okay. So if we look at the layers of the heart wall, so I'll just look at the layers of the heart wall. The outer layer I already mentioned is the epicardium, which is also the visceral pericardium. Okay, so that's the outermost layer of the wall. Then we have what is called the myocardium. So what does myo mean? What's myo? What do you say, like myofascial release massage? What are we talking about? Muscle, right? So myo means muscle. So this is cardiac muscle. And we'll talk about the special cardiac muscle properties. Okay. And then we have the endocardium. And this lines the inside of the heart. And so this is epithelial tissue lining the inside of the heart. And it is actually continuous with the blood vessels. So the lining of the heart and the lining of the blood vessels are kind of made of the same thing. And it's really important for our blood vessels and for our heart to have really smooth linings, because we don't want platelets and other things to attach to them and lead to clotting. So that smooth endocardium is really important for proper blood flow. Okay, so if you look at this diagram back up here, this is the endocardium right here. This is the myocardium, the layer of muscle, and then this is the epicardium. Okay, so let's look at the circulation. And so our heart is kind of strange. I think it's a strange pump. Like if I was going to design a pump, I'm not sure I would put it together the way it is. Because if you think about it, blood comes in and it's kind of like a blind-ended pouch. So like if I was going to design a pump, it would probably look more like a fish heart. So in a fish heart, we have blood coming into an atrium, which stores, and then we have a ventricle, so it kind of looks like this, and then blood goes out. So we have an atrium, which receives the heart. So think about atrium, think about like in buildings, they put atriums in to try to prevent heat loss or gain through the front doors. So this is the flow of blood, right? And then we have a ventricle. Okay, so this is my fish heart. Okay. Now the problem, however, is that we do not have one circuit in our circulation. So this is a single circuit. So blood goes out to the gills, then out to the body, and then back to the atrium. So this is a single circuit system. There's only one type of blood coming to the heart, okay? So the reason why we have a strange looking heart is because we have a double circuit circulation. So what this means is that we have what is referred to as the pulmonary circuit, which takes blood out to the lungs and then back to the heart. And then we have the systemic circuit. Okay. So to make a whole circuit of our circulatory system, we actually have to go to the heart twice, right? So we go to the heart, the blood goes out to the lungs, it comes back to the heart, then it goes out to the body, and then it comes back to the heart. So this means that it has to return to the heart twice. Okay, so blood. Okay, so we, instead of having a two-chambered heart, have a four-chambered heart. And the four-chambered heart ensures separation, maybe allows for, allows for separation of oxygenated and unoxygenated blood. Okay, so it's four-chambered. So the two receiving chambers, we have two atria. And in our heart, and in most mammals' hearts, there's an extension of this chamber that looks like an ear-like structure on the surface of the heart, and those are called auricles. So two atria, and these have with auricles. Okay, so auricle actually means ear. But what this does is this increases the capacity of the atria to hold blood. So we have increased capacity due to the auricles. And when you actually look at the heart, what you see are the auricles, and I'll show you that in the picture in a minute. You don't really see the atria, the rest of the atria, but it's there. Okay. So we have two atria. They receive the blood. They do not tend to be very muscular. We have then two ventricles. These pump the blood. Okay. And specifically, the left ventricle is more muscular. Does anybody know why? To the whole body. Yeah. So not just to the lungs. Right. So it pumps blood to the whole body. Okay, so let's look at a diagram of our circuits and then of the heart. Okay, so this is an important diagram because it shows blood going out via the right side of the heart to the lungs, and that is what is referred to as the pulmonary circuit. And we're going to talk about the difference between arteries and veins and capillaries in the next chapter. But you'll notice that the blood goes out and then it branches into small capillaries because that is where gas exchange takes place in the lungs. And then it comes back and is oxygenated. Remember, we talked about red and blue, that the unoxygenated blood really isn't blue, but that's just the way we draw it on the paper, right? And so then it comes back, and then this moves out, and then it goes through the pulmonary circuit. So you'll notice that the left ventricle is thicker walled than the right ventricle because it has to pump blood out to the far reaches of the body to all the capillary beds. So think about the capillaries in the skin of your toes, for example, right? All the way out to every part of the body. Okay, so that's the systemic. So think about systemic is system-wide, okay, whereas pulmonary means lung. Okay, so if we look at the structure of the heart, we have, which we already started talking about, but we have valves. And it's important that these valves, that we realize that the valves are mechanical. So they're actually open and close due to the forces exerted on them by the blood. So it's not like a little electrical impulse goes to the valve and it closes. That would be electrical valve. A mechanical valve opens and closes when pressure is exerted on it. And so these open and close due to the movement of the blood. Okay, so we have what are called atrioventricular valves. Short is AV valves. Okay, it's easy to remember that these are the valves between the atria and the ventricles. But because we have two atria and two ventricles, there's two atrioventricular valves. So when we talk about the right valve, it is called, has another name, and it is called the tricuspid. Okay. The left valve has another name, and it is called the bicuspid, but it actually has another name, which is called the mitral valve. Okay, so right is tricuspid, left is bicuspid, but when they talk about mitral valve prolapse or failure, this is the valve that is typically they have to go in and surgically replace or fix, because this is the one that's actually under quite a bit of pressure on the left side because the left ventricle pumps more hard than the right ventricle, okay? We also have what are called semilunar valves. So you can think of half moon. And these are between the ventricles and the arteries and veins that carry the blood out of the heart. So for example, we have the pulmonary semilunar, which is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. The trunk then branches into right and left to go to different parts, different sides of the body, the right and left lungs. And then we have the aortic semilunar. And this is between the left ventricle and the aorta, or the aortic arch. We'll put just aorta. semilunar. Okay, so if we look at a diagram of our structure of the heart, we'll come back to that in a second. This is a diagram that shows the internal structures. And so this is the atria. So you'll notice that blood is coming in to the right atrium first, and then pressure differences. The right atrium is going to contract against the blood, and then it's going to force blood into the right ventricle, and then it's going to relax. So the atria relaxes, and it helps to close that valve, and then the movement of blood up also helps to close that valve. Now notice particularly the semilunar valves. When blood comes up, it's going to have a tendency to backflow. And so this is a really good example of a mechanical valve in action, because it's that backflow of blood that is actually going to close the valve, right? So those pockets, the semilunar valves, the pockets collect blood and the valve will close. But the valve opens, you'll notice when the blood is, if this contracts and the blood flows, the pressure differences, the movement of blood will open the valve, okay? So then this would be the mitral or bicuspid valve that gets damaged a lot. And then you can just barely make out the aortic semilunar right here. And so you can see that that would then eventually connect to the aorta or the aortic arch as it comes out of the heart. Okay. So you can kind of see how strange the system is, because if blood comes in, we don't want blood to be forced and pressure of the blood to actually force the blood down because of this blinded sac. So when the heart contracts, it actually contracts from the bottom up. So the ventricles will start their contraction from the bottom up, and it'll force the blood to flow smoothly up and out of the heart, rather than making the blood move erratically inside the heart. We'll talk about when that happens, and it's called fibrillation. So if we look at the structure of the heart, and this is something we're going to be studying in lab next week. So you're like, what are those ear-like structures? So those are the auricles, but those are only the most superficial part of the atrium. So remember that they just are little they fill up with blood. They're kind of increase the carrying capacity. And then this is sometimes confusing because this is the apex of the heart. And sometimes when we think about apex, we think of top, right? But the apex of the heart is at the bottom. And this is actually what is referred to as the base of the heart. And the base of the heart sits right on the diaphragm. So you can think of the diaphragm as a dome-shaped muscle that would sit right here. Okay, so some of the major blood vessels that you need to know when we talk about blood flow are the vena cavas. So we can talk about the superior and inferior vena cavas. Vena cavas, is it plural? Cavas, I think vena cavas. I don't know. I'll have to look at that. Let me look at how that's spelled. But it's plural. I think there's an E on the end of it. I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, these return blood from the body. Okay. And the blood goes into the right atrium. And I'll just abbreviate that. Okay. So there's one coming from the top and there's one coming from the bottom, right? And they come in and they take the blood to the right atrium. So from the right atrium, blood flows to the right ventricle. And then out via the pulmonary arteries. Now, what you need to realize is that arteries and veins are named as to whether or not they're carrying blood away from the heart or towards the heart. And so pulmonary arteries actually are one of the few arteries, except when we talk about circulation in embryos and in fetuses. This artery is unoxygenated. So we'll put O2. Okay. So it is a blue artery. And so you're going to get so confused because you're like, it's blue, it's got to be a vein, but that's not the case, right? Because an artery is something that carries blood out from the heart. Okay. So from the pulmonary arteries, blood flows from the lungs back back to the heart, pulmonary veins. Okay, so these are O2 rich. So it's important to realize in your diagram, these are going to be red, even though they're veins. Okay. So the blood enters the left atria, flows to the left ventricle, and leaves the heart via the aorta. So this is a major artery, okay, that is leaving the heart. And it would be red because it's carrying oxygenated blood out, right? The superior and inferior vena cavas are blue because they're carrying unoxygenated blood back to the heart. So on a quiz, like next Wednesday when we have our quiz, right, you'll be given maybe a diagram of the heart, right? And so you should know that this is the superior vena cava, this is the inferior vena cava, this is the right atrium, right ventricle, this is the pulmonary trunk, this is the pulmonary artery, these are pulmonary veins, they're red, they're coming in the left side, they go into this part of the heart, the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta. Okay. Now we also have circulation. Oh, we talked about valves. Oh, I wanted to show the valves. Okay, so this is a diagram from your book that also shows the function of the valves, how they open due to the pressure of the blood moving, and how they close, right? So this would be the closing of the pulmonary valves, right? And mechanical and the flow of blood opening and closing the valves. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the coronary circulation. So when you think of coronary, you think heart, right? So the heart circulation is the blood that transports oxygen and nutrients to the heart itself, right? So these are vessels that service the heart muscle. Right? Because heart muscle obviously is going to need lots of oxygen so that it can produce ATP and allow for contraction to occur. Okay, so vessels that serve the vessels that service the heart muscle, okay, which is called the myocardium. So you'll notice that on the surface of the heart, right, we have arteries. And so the coronary arteries would carry oxygenated blood to the heart muscle. And these are the vessels that get clogged up. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about atherosclerosis. But you can have clogs in these blood vessels, which could lead to a embolism. And then you could also have the heart muscle not getting enough oxygen and nutrients, and the heart muscle dying, which is what is referred to as a myocardial infarction. Okay, so we have the coronary arteries, which is nutrient and oxygen rich. Rich blood. Okay, if they are blocked, you can have what is called a myocardial infarction. And this is a heart attack. Okay. So when they talk about doing bypass surgeries, oftentimes they go in there and they build blood vessels to bypass the blockages. Sometimes they go in there and they put stents in the blood vessels to open up the blockages. But we'll talk more about that when we get to atherosclerosis and the blood vessels. Okay, so then instead of coronary veins, which would be easy to remember, these are called cardiac veins. And they carry blood. They carry blood away from the heart muscle. And all these blood vessels converge in what is called the coronary sinus. So it empties the blood into the coronary, which is actually on the back of the heart, the coronary sinus. So think of sinus as a big opening. So all the blood that has gone to the heart goes back to the sinus. And then this is connected to the right atrium. Right, so it's connected, the coronary sinus is connected to the right atrium. So there's a little hole that the blood comes back into the right atrium. So if we were to look at this diagram, okay, these are the cardiac veins, right? And it's shown kind of in light color because it's in the back of the heart. And so this would be the coronary sinus, right? And then the blood would go from the coronary sinus back into the right atrium. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today.
Oh, did you?